This is episode 17 of my 2023 training diaries. But I'm not really training anymore because I'm pretty firmly into my off season now and still slowly building my volume back up, being 7 weeks out from the Moab 240. So in this video, I'm going to take a look back at my entire season of training leading up to the race to sort of put it all into perspective. My first main goal for the season was the Bob Graham Round in early July, which is a timed challenge, so not a race, but still something that I was training specifically for. I enlisted the help of Coach Eric Carter, who works with Gary Robbins at Ridgeline Athletics, to design my coaching program. Eric had helped me in lead up to UTMB last year and had designed my program in lead up to Tour des Géants back in 2018 as well. And I always find it helpful to have outside expertise when I'm training for unique goals like the one that I had this year, and especially when trying to combine more than one event alongside a bunch of travel and other adventures. But we didn't actually start working together on that plan until May. I had some other adventures already planned for earlier in the spring, so there wasn't a lot of room for much strategic training anyway. It was really just about building some volume. One of the tools I began to rely more on throughout this season was the Coros Training Hub, which gave me some additional insight into my training load and other metrics, and I'll be showing you that later in this video. And I carried a few cameras with me throughout the season. You've seen a lot of this footage already in the previous 16 episodes of my training diaries, including the Insta360 X3 camera. And Insta360 provided financial support for a few of my adventures this season. So before we jump in, I'd like to first thank them for also sponsoring this video. My regular viewers would have noticed me beginning to shoot an increasing amount of 360 footage for my films a couple of years ago, including on some of my longer documentaries, like my film from UTMB. I always try to shoot from a variety of camera angles in order to make my sequences more visually compelling, and the Insta360 is like having an extra wide camera lens. My favorite angle to shoot from is from top down and usually a little out in front and to the side, especially when I'm on an exposed ridge or any kind of really epic terrain. And unlike my other cameras, it automatically removes the selfie stick from the shot when it stitches the image from the two lenses together. And that invisible selfie stick is what makes the drone-like shot, like it's being filmed from a third-person perspective. And this is especially useful when filming in places like national parks where drones aren't allowed. It also gives me more control in post-production, since all I need to do is hit record and basically stick the camera up in the air, but I can then reframe my shot later on. There's no risk of missing the action, since it's recording in all directions all the time in 5.7K resolution. So I can focus on what I'm doing as I traverse a ridge or reach a summit, which is where I use the Insta360 quite a bit throughout this season. I'll provide a link in the description below where you can learn more and shop for the camera yourself, but you'll be seeing a lot more footage from the X3 in some of my other films that I shot this season that I'm still working on. I came into the year with decent mileage in my legs, running between around 45 to 65 kilometers per week throughout January, in between backcountry skiing, which I was still doing once or twice per week. In February, I started increasing my running volume to a little over 80 kilometers per week, and I started going to the gym twice per week, so I ran about 300 kilometers that month. My focus at that point was preparing for our first adventure run in March down in Patagonia, which would be a fairly big week of training. So this was one of those cases where I was basically training for the upcoming week of training, where we'd be running 145 kilometers around Torres del Paine National Park, so close to 100 miles over 6 days. And even with all that travel, I managed to cover a little over 400 kilometers in March. That fast pack was a good early season confidence booster for me, getting some good mileage and climbing in my legs. As I then returned home and prepared to leave again in mid-April for Arizona, where a group of us planned on running the Grand Canyon rim to rim to rim. The North Rim ended up being closed for repairs, so we didn't end up doing that 50-mile route as planned, but did find a great alternative on the Tonto Trail, which was closer to 52 kilometers. So along with some other adventures in the area, I covered just over 100 kilometers that week, with a fair bit of elevation change, but that all added up to less than 300 kilometers for the month. After that, I maintained my mileage at between about 55 to 60 kilometers per week, as I pretty much tapered in lead up to my first race of the season in early May, the Wild Horse Traverse 50K, just a few hours from our home here in the interior of British Columbia. That was also around the time when I started working with Eric on a training program, so he had included a couple of sort of strategic workouts in lead up to the race. The week after that, I treated it as a bit of a recovery week, and the following weekend, we headed to Los Angeles for Billy and Hillary's wedding. But as soon as I was back, it was time to start building volume again with the Bob Graham Round just around the corner. So I capped off that week at over 120 kilometers with a fair bit of vert. And so for May, I managed to run 334 kilometers, including that race, and despite all of that travel. The following week was a little hectic as I left for England, but as soon as I arrived in the Lake District that first week of June, I began to ramp up my mileage again. And that continued at over 100 kilometers per week with significant elevation change all the way through my Bob Graham Round attempt that first weekend of July. So June doesn't look like the biggest month on paper at just 360 kilometers, but I did do a lot of climbing along with a couple of workouts, including a short fell race. And of course, the Bob itself was a full-on 100-kilometer, basically race pace effort, but that was counted towards July's mileage since I started it on July 1st. Audrey had joined me for that last week in the lakes to support me on the Bob, and so then we spent the first week of July sightseeing around southern England, which meant a lot of very low-intensity walking and finally some easy running, before we headed the next week to France and then on to Switzerland for Audrey's race, the Eiger 100K. All right, so I'm just doing my run hike for the day. I'm gonna hike up to the aid station at the 70-kilometer mark to see Audrey. We then spent the next 2 weeks in Annecy, France, where I began to build volume again before running the Tour de Mont Blanc. We were hosting a group this time on the TMB, so we spread the mileage out over 6 days at a pretty easy pace. But that was a good 100-mile week of training with a lot of elevation change, of course, as well. So again, the Bob was included in July's mileage, along with the first of those 6 days on the tour. So July came in at close to 390 kilometers. I used the following week to recover as we traveled to Slovenia before our next big fast-packing adventure on the Slovenia Mountain Trail. We didn't cover quite as much distance on that fast pack, but those were pretty long days on feet and on very technical terrain with a lot of climbing. So great preparation for the race we'd be doing in Spain in September. We then did some running in Barcelona where they were experiencing a heat wave, so it was even hotter than usual. And then I did a bit more running, including an uphill tempo run, as soon as we arrived in the Pyrenees, where we were preparing to run the Pyrenees stage run the first week of September. So August was a big month at 400 kilometers and with a ton of elevation change, including most of the Tour de Mont Blanc, those last 5 days, and our fast pack in Slovenia. Now the Pyrenees stage run, that was a big week. And while Audrey was treating this as her goal race for the year, for me it was really just a week of training, which worked out great since I could run at her pace, which was still at a very good effort for me, but just below what would be considered race pace. So that was more than 220 kilometers with 15,000 meters of elevation gain in just 7 days. Definitely my biggest week ever of training. And since it was just training, I still had to cover close to 90 kilometers the week after as I traveled back home here to Canada, and close to 120 kilometers the week after, which included a few sauna sessions for heat training. I talked about my approach to heat training back in episode 14, in case you want to hear more about that. Then it was finally time to head to Moab. The week we left, I covered close to 100 kilometers as I began my taper, and that gave me a total of over 500 kilometers for the month of September, which I was feeling pretty good about. I followed that with just a 50-kilometer week with one hill workout, and most of those runs I tried to do right on the Moab 240 course. Then it was race week, which consisted mostly of easy running and walking, along with one short tempo workout as sort of a race prep set 2 days before the race. And we started the race on the Friday. So looking back at all of this, you can see that my training for Moab really started way back in March with our fast pack around Torres del Paine National Park, followed by that big run in the Grand Canyon in April and my 50K tune-up race in May. I then trained really hard for the Bob Graham Round, and that I did have to recover from. But as a 22-hour effort, I think it was probably a net positive in terms of preparing me for Moab. I don't think that it set me back at all. And of course, it was a big accomplishment in itself for me, and one of my big goals checked off my list. Here's what all that looks like in the Coros Training Hub in terms of training load, which is a metric that takes into account both the intensity and duration of your workouts. You can see those initial efforts throughout the spring as spikes in my weekly training load, in lead up to the month I spent in England for the Bob Graham Round. My fast-packing adventures on the Tour de Mont Blanc and in Slovenia were what in turn prepared me for the Pyrenees stage run in September. Because if I hadn't adequately trained in lead up to PSR and then had to push too hard there, the increase in peak training load from month to month would have been much too high, and I may have ended up tiring myself out in lead up to Moab. But instead, I was able to treat that, as I said, as basically just a massive week of time on feet and at a really good effort. My time spent in the desert in those final couple of weeks, along with the heat training that I did in the sauna, was just the icing on the cake. But I hope you can see how in training for a race like this, it's not about any one training block. Because as I said, even that big month I did in September with the race in Spain, that was only building on the volume that had been in my legs from the month prior, and so on. Training really is an additive process in that way, and that's why it's so important that you do have some kind of training program so that we can map out this kind of progression and not try to build up too quickly, or worst case, try to cram for the test. And throughout the season, as you probably know by now, I've relied primarily on 2 brands for my nutrition while on the run. I used Nax bars, waffles, purees, and energy drink mix. And I experimented this season by also incorporating exogenous ketones from Ketone IQ, both for while on the run and to help with recovery. And those seem particularly beneficial for my 2 longer efforts, for the Bob Graham Round and the Moab 240, where I was taking a dose roughly every 4 hours. And I've got discount codes in the description in case you want to test either brand for yourself. Now, I've mentioned the Tour de Mont Blanc a few times, and the trip that we hosted this year sold out in record time, in less than 24 hours. And so I know that at least a few of you were disappointed at having missed out. This year, it looks like I'll be doing another big race in Europe to get another Hard Rock qualifier, since I wasn't successful on this year's lottery again. And it's gonna take me some time to recover from that. But Audrey wanted to go back and do the tour again. So she's gonna do something a little different this time, and we'll be hosting a women's only fast pack of the Tour de Mont Blanc. And we expect this one to sell out fast again. So ladies, be sure to put your name on the list at the address below to be the first to be notified as soon as registration opens up. We'll be working again with Vagabond Trails on this one, who did a really great job. That's of course who we're working with for the upcoming running retreat in Ecuador this coming April. And I believe there's just a couple of spots left now for that. So for any couples or for any of the guys who still want to join us on a running adventure in 2024, I'll include a link to that one as well in the description below.